Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Centre for Global Development. My name is Rajesh Merchandani. I'm the Vice President of Communications and Policy Outreach, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here this afternoon. Thank you for braving the Washington heat this afternoon. And to all of those of you who are watching via the live stream, it's around the world. It's great to have you join us as well. Now, for those of you who don't know much about us, the Centre for Global Development, as you can tell by our clever logo, has been around for 15 years now, researching development policy from all angles: aid, trade, migration, finance, climate, health, education, security, technology, the list goes on. Trying to find those small policy tweaks that will increase global prosperity and make the rules of the global game fairer for all. Our work and the facts show that huge progress on development has already been made. It's certainly not the lost cause that some would have us believe. But our event today is called Redoubling Our Resolve for Global Development. So why do we need to do that when less than a year ago, the world came together to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, a historic blueprint for a better, more prosperous, safer, cleaner, more equitable world? Well, the truth is that today those commitments are even more urgent thanks to the serious challenges that we face to the global economy: low growth, weak commodity prices, financial markets on a roller coaster ride, and the geopolitical uncertainties caused by things like mass migrations of people and Brexit. The implications for the poorest nations are stark. Now, on the way in, you might have picked up a couple of blogs that we've written recently about those issues. You can also find them on our website at cgdev.org. If you'd like to join in this conversation online, we'd love you to tweet using the hashtag CGDTalks. You can see it there at the bottom of the screen. Today, we're going to think about the steps that countries, international institutions, the global community can take to support low-income developing countries to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. We are honored to welcome Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF, now at the start of her second 5-year term in charge of the organization. We're particularly honored, Madame Lagarde, to welcome you today on the 227th anniversary of Bastille Day. We're also delighted to host you as part of our Development Leaders series, something we've been doing all year to mark CGD's 15th anniversary, and doubly welcome to have you here now as our founding president, Nancy Birdsall, prepares to step down. She will continue as a senior fellow here at the Centre, following her passion for research, the kind of development policy research that has helped the Centre make its name in our first 15 years. We'll hear from Nancy during today's event, but first, please welcome IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde to speak to us this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. And I couldn't think of a better place than the CGD to celebrate liberté, égalité, fraternité. So thank you very much. Sororité, tu as raison. So again, thank you very much for having me, and happy birthday for the celebration of your 15th anniversary. I think that as I said, liberté, égalité, fraternité is just very much in sync with the values by which the CGD stands and by which you stand personally, Nancy. And I would like to pay tribute to you. I know this is not your last event. There will be many more to come, but I know that you're thinking about the future. And this moment is certainly one for me to thank you very much for your leadership, for having formed this incredible think tank, which is more than just think, which is also stimulate, which is bring together, which is also about action. And this is very much what I like many things about you, but the way in which, with a smile, with persistence, resilience, you actually push us into thinking a little bit outside the box, or encouraging those who are prepared to think outside the box. And to me, you've been a great, great support in that respect. So thank you very much for having done that, for doing it, for continuing to do it in whichever form, capacity, under whatever flag or other symbols you care to add to your hat. Yeah. And on a sort of more IMF note, I would like to also thank you very much, because I don't think that you have ever been in my presence or the presence of any IMF representative or any representative in this town without mentioning year after year that actually delivering on the quota increase and the governance reform of the IMF was critically important. So thank you very much. It's now a done deal, and thank you to you and many of those who have supported that laborious but eventually a completed project now. You did mention, Rajay, Brexit, but it certainly did not take Brexit to understand that low growth, rising inequality, and lack of jobs, particularly in many countries not far from the UK, have combined with social and geopolitical concerns to fuel the rise of what is a real threat to cooperation. And by that I mean populism, nationalism that we see in many corners of the world. And I believe that one of the greatest challenges, if not the greatest challenge that we are facing now, is the risk of the world actually turning its back on global cooperation, a cooperation that has served us well. And there is one group of countries that would suffer particularly as a result of that risk that I have just identified. And that group of countries is the group of 60 low-income countries in the world. And ironically, it is precisely those countries that actually offer promise to the future global economies. Now, why is that? Because simply their population grows. And while their population grows, the population in advanced and many of the emerging market economies ages and gradually will shrink. Now, those 60 countries altogether account for about 1/5 of the world's population. And last year, as you indicated, the whole world made this really strong commitment in order to finance development and in order to set a goal for 2030 that would really enable them to reach that sustainable development set of goals, imperatives that we set for ourselves. Now, this was a moment for celebration, and it took a lot of effort, and it was laborious to reach those agreements. But it's not enough to agree on those goals. It's far more important to actually act upon them and to implement the goals and make sure that we deliver against those objectives that we have set for ourselves. And we need to do so despite the fact that there are many challenges on the horizon. So that's the first thing that I would like to discuss. It's this list of challenges. I've selected randomly some of them. There are many more, but there are particular challenges that we need to focus on as we define the policies that need to be adopted in order to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. The mission to improve living conditions in developing countries has come a long way in the last 15 years, ever since this Center for Global Development was set up. 1 billion people escaped extreme poverty, helped indeed in particular by the growth of China and India. Child mortality was drastically reduced, and significant inroads were made in order to defeat AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. That battle is not completely won yet, but there have been significant progress. And economic growth in most low-income countries was strong, averaging in the last 15 years 6%, which was up from 3.5% in the 90s. That's the rosy side of things, because yet, by the same token, millions of people were left behind. Growth in some fragile states in that group of 60, has averaged just about 2 to 3% since the turn of the millennium. And of the 60 low-income countries, only 16 met the target for extreme poverty reduction. So without a sharp improvement of growth in those countries, 20 of them are unlikely to actually meet that goal by 2030. And that leaves the global community with a task expressed best, in my view, by Nelson Mandela. And that should rejuvenate, reinvigorate that sense of cooperation within the international community. And I quote him, "As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest." So our main objective is clear. It has been defined and shaped by the Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed last year and that took after the Millennium Goals. And it may be tempting to think that we will make further progress if we simply continue down the steady path that we have been following. But unfortunately, there have been sufficiently new and quite daunting challenges that actually require that we look at how we deliver and how quickly we deliver. So let me mention 3 of those challenges that we have on our plate. The first one is a demographic change. By 2035, the number of sub-Saharan Africans reaching working age will exceed that of the rest of the world combined. Now, many of us have said, written, and sometimes given beautiful speeches about this demographic dividend that Africa has, and how Africa will rise thanks to that dividend, and how it will increase per capita income and drive growth in Africa and around the world. And yes, it may well be a dividend, but it could also be a curse. If we were not able to provide this coming generation with livelihood and a chance to share in this global welfare, we should be prepared for migration and political strife at an unprecedented level. And we should not assume that the sea, the hardship of traveling, will suffice to actually put a hold to that inevitable move. That's the first challenge. Second challenge is climate change. Climate change, and particularly natural disasters, as is sometimes more politically correct to call climate change, actually affects much more poorer countries. Between 2006 and 2015, they hit low-income countries 1.5 times more often than more developed countries. And more than 3/4 of low-income countries are either highly or extremely vulnerable to climate change. These stresses from climate change could also translate in significant migration pressures and heightened risk of conflict. Third challenge, the risk of violent conflict, which remains indeed present in many of those low-income countries, including as a result of civil war, terrorism. The World Development Report, another seed sown by Nancy, has found that for every 3 years a country is affected by major violence, poverty reduction lags behind the average by almost 3 percentage points. The impact of growth is also sobering. Since the turn of the millennium, real per capita GDP in fragile states has risen by only 15%, compared with 70% in other LIDC countries, not including those fragile states. So those are 3 challenges that are clearly associated with the low-income and developing countries. But in addition to these long-term challenges, the global economic environment is not really giving us a hand. It was my hope that our July World Economic Outlook update that we will be publishing on the 19th of July would, for the first time in quite a few years, see an uptick. We would revise upward. And I had prepared my smile already for that. And then Brexit happens. So I have very little hope that it will be revised up, and I have a serious concern that it might be revised down a bit. So that's one thing. In addition to that, particularly for low-income countries, slowing demand from China and the commodity price drop has hurt exporters of raw materials, while at the same time not providing as much as we had expected boost to the consumption by the importing countries. So where does that leave us? Well, I'm sure that I will not surprise many of you if I maintain that in order to maintain resilience, it is imperative to have sound macroeconomic management. Now, the reason is fairly simple. A big part of low-income countries' relative success in recent years is owed partly, not exclusively, but partly to sound economic policies. And by that, I mean low inflation, manageable fiscal deficits, competitive exchange rates, and low public debt levels. The experience of the last financial crisis clearly demonstrated the value of preparing for the rainy day through prudent policies. If you look at the post-financial crisis in 2009, for instance, while others were left reeling, growth remained positive in over 80% of the low-income countries, thanks in part to the measures that they had adopted in the years before. And indeed, we estimate that as much as 3/5 of a country's economic performance depends on its domestic policies more than the external demand that is addressed to it. Now, you will be perfectly legitimate in asking me whether I don't have any other recommendations than low inflation, good fiscal policies, and low debt. You know, spinach is good for you too. But it's not your grandmother's IMF, as I have said before. So I would like to focus our attention to 3 strands of work that we have engaged in with our member countries in the recent years, including by way of pilot country cases. And I'll explain to that if you are interested. So these trends focus on raising resources for development. We call it in the jargon DRM, domestic revenue mobilization, among other things. Second, promoting efficient infrastructure investment. And 3, inclusive growth. And I will explain what I mean by that. Let's turn first of all to resources. More and more low-income countries can actually use tools to mobilize by themselves, broadening revenues, better, larger tax base, and strengthening, consolidating their tax administration. Is there space for that? Well, given that about half of those low-income countries have tax ratios that are below 15%, if they were only to go to 15%, that would give ample room to generate more revenues. And 15% is a relatively low rate as compared with the ones that emerging market economies, for instance, have. At the same time, because this is all very well raising domestic revenue, but at the same time, the international community has to be mindful that the resources and the tax base has to be there and available in those countries. So it is welcome that international institutions, including the OECD, including the World Bank, including the IMF, the United Nations, have pushed in the direction of making sure that international taxation actually protects those base and takes action against the profit shifting and the tax base erosion that is more often than not to the prejudice and detriment of those low-income countries. So we are working together closely with the OECD, with the World Bank, on what is called the BEPS project, base erosion and profit shifting. So revenue mobilization is one way to generate resources. There is obviously as well official aid, which accounts for now a more modest share of flows to developing countries these days. If you look at the official numbers, official ODA has risen by 5% in real terms in 2015. But you have to look underneath that number, and it's a little bit deceptive, because in that 7% increase, you actually find a lot of the domestic spending on refugees, which qualifies as ODA. So the bottom line is that ODA as a share of gross national income remains at just about 0.3%. Now 0.3% compares with the commitment that was made to spend 0.7%, particularly in the advanced economies. And there are not many of those economies that are actually committed to that 0.7%. Hasten to add that the United Kingdom actually spends that 0.7%, and I very much hope that they continue. So there is clearly room for a lift from that 0.3% to a 0.7%. And I would certainly hope that countries can follow suit on their commitment. Final leg of this resource point that I want to make is a source which is increasing in terms of percentage of contribution to the domestic revenue in low-income countries, and that is workers' remittances sent from generally advanced or emerging market economies to low-income countries. But on that front, the transaction costs are extremely high. Transaction costs account for an average of 8% from the source, where the work is being discharged, to the recipient country, which is generally the low-income countries. So that really has to be reduced, and I think the G20 commitment that was made to reduce that 8% has to really be delivered upon. Now, I'll be giving a speech next Monday, I think, Monday morning, at the New York Fed to actually argue the case that correspondent bankings have to be maintained or alternative options have to be made available so that we do not end up with this debanking / de-risking, exposing those countries to the risk of shadow arrangements and alternative, probably quite toxic mechanisms of transferring finance. So that's what I wanted to say about resources. The second trend of work that we have in place and where we have tried to deliver practical tools for the low-income countries is in relation to infrastructure. Because generating the resources is fine, but those resources can be leveraged and certainly have to be put to good use. Our main focus has been, in the work that we do with countries, is to improve public infrastructure. Again, consider that 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa together generate only the same amount of electricity as just one advanced economy, Spain. Now, clearly, if the continent is to realize its potential, better infrastructure is needed, and power is certainly one target destination. But the price tag is significant. UNCTAD's estimates that total infrastructure investment needs in developing countries range from $3.3 trillion to $4.5 trillion a year. And striking the right balance between scaling up the investment and the spending and maintaining sustainable debt is therefore critical. And it's one of the reasons why we have revised our debt policies towards low-income countries, because it's a trade-off. Countries have to maintain a debt that is not going to collapse the economy, but equally they have to be able to invest. And what we have done to actually help countries is devise tools and mechanisms that they can use for themselves to actually analyze their procurement mechanism, analyze the way in which they build their financing for infrastructure in order to make sure that they actually leverage in the best possible conditions, the financing for those infrastructure projects. So, third area where we're doing work with our member countries in the low-income countries group is how to actually make sure that the growth that will be generated by resources put to good use in infrastructure actually generates growth that is inclusive. Now, we're not doing that just because it's a social imperative, but also because, based on our research, it makes growth more sustainable and more robust. I think we probably all will agree that investing in health and education is particularly important in developing human capital. These investments are long-term investment. They require state resources, but they're also going to be high returns. Why is that? Because it will boost productivity and it will improve human well-being. And if I had to pick and choose in which area I would myself invest in development, I would certainly pick and choose girls' education. More broadly, in that vein, improving gender equity, particularly access to health, access to finance, is a safe bet to promote inclusive growth. And I'm quite encouraged by a working paper by our staff. I'm just doing a little bit of advertising here because it is being published today on the occasion of me coming to, as you called it, my second home, CGD. This paper is actually showing that empowering women from an economic point of view supports economic diversification. And we all know that for some of the low-income countries, in particular those that are producing raw materials, the imperative is to make sure that they're not dependent on that extraction and rarely transformation of raw materials, but that the economy is diversified. So empowering women is actually helpful to that effect. I strongly encourage you to look at this paper. Finally, let me again go back to financial issues. Promoting financial inclusion is very important. Financial development, by which I mean widening the use of existing financial instruments and adopting new ones, can pay big dividends. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, we estimate that growth could be about 1.5 percentage points higher if we were able to bring the level of financial development closer to the international average. So that's quite an agenda. And you too at the CGD have a big agenda that is to be delivered upon. And I trust that the Centre will continue in the same exemplary way that you have built it. And I can assure you that from the IMF perspective, we will also deliver on that agenda. And I think we will not be alone. And if they allow me, because I know some of them are in the room, to speak just for a microsecond on behalf of our sister institution across the street, the World Bank, certainly together with the World Bank, we will continue to carry those initiatives forward together and in our respective missions, certainly in close coordination. We actually have a proud history of supporting low-income countries, and I'd like to highlight just some of the few things that we have done lately in order to support low-income countries, because often the IMF is associated with, this sort of serious, quite rigorous, and very fiscally focused institutions. Well, we do that, but we also do that with a particular concern which is country-specific and which has to do with the level of development and the level of social safety net that has to be made available. So let me first of all touch on one which is most of you, I'm sure, are aware of, which is the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, the HIPC, which has helped delivered over $76 billion of debt relief for the world's poorest countries since 1996. Since 2005, the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, the MDRI, delivered an additional $50 billion of debt relief. And by alleviating these debt burdens, recipient countries managed to increase poverty-reducing expenditure on average by almost 3 percentage points of GDP. Second initiative that was taken more recently, after the financial crisis, the IMF provided $13 billion in concessional financing. And last year, in the context of the Financing for Development Summit in Addis Abeba, we decided, the board approved the expansion of access to concessional lending by 50% and retained 0% interest rates on those loans. In addition, more importantly, we have increased our capacity development efforts in areas such as domestic revenue mobilization and public financial management. I just listed these two areas as key priorities for our work going forward, and that is where we're stepping up capacity building efforts in a significant way. In addition to that, we of course have a major fundraising effort that is currently underway to allow us to provide this service to our members at the required scale. And we're doing that in very close collaboration, as I've mentioned, with the World Bank. And I very much welcome the bank's initiative on helping refugees, fighting infectious diseases, and of course their goal on ending extreme poverty by 2030. I know that there have been recently a few rumors and nice little pieces of news about the fact that maybe the World Bank is infringing on the territory of the IMF and considering loans that maybe would have belonged to the natural turf of the World Bank. Well, I can assure you that we are very closely in touch on these operations, and we can think of a couple of countries that have hit the radar screen of the media, where the bank and the IMF are really working hand in hand to make sure that the macroeconomic framework is solid and that there is as much support as possible for sustainable development and solid growth going forward. This brings me to my conclusion. I think that we stand at a critical moment. The sort of excitement and momentum that we had last year after both the Addis Abeba summit and then the Paris summit on climate change and the approval in September at the United Nations of the Sustainable Development Goals should not be left to drift. And we, all of us in our respective organizations, with our respective missions, must make sure that we focus on delivery, on implementation. It is going to take time, it's going to be gradual, it will face obstacles, and the challenges on the road will be many. But we have to stay focused on delivering for those that will ultimately be the beneficiaries of those goals. Unless we get it badly wrong in the next few years, we firmly believe that 1.3 billion people living in low-income developing countries will have greater opportunities than ever before to benefit from and contribute to the global economy. It's not just good news for them, it's also good news for the other, for the moment, 6 billion inhabitants of the planet, because they will all benefit from this. And I hope the Mandela quote resonates with you at this point in time. With the right policies to reap its demographic dividend, for instance, per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa could be, and I dare say should be, and I dare say will be, 50% higher by 2050. But reaching this target will require strong external support and major investment in human and physical capital. Around 18 million jobs, new jobs, will be needed each year between now and 2035, alongside a major shift from informal to formal work. This is a tall order, and I wish, Nancy, that we could continue to count on your leadership in this effort. I know we will. And we will carry on in your spirit, doubling down on the quest for economic development. I would like to just finish with a quote by Nelson Mandela again, because I think it really epitomizes what can be achieved if we don't revert back to our within boundaries issues, but are completely alert and mobilized on the need to cooperate and to be mindful of those global issues which will not go local, they will stay global, which is why we have to continue that cooperation. and we have to do it together. So that's what he said. When people are determined, they can overcome anything together. That's Nelson Mandela. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Madame Lagarde, on Bastille Day. I just wanted to start by congratulating you. You were so kind to me about leadership, but congratulating you on this really almost puff piece in the Financial Times about the changes at the IMF under your leadership. Sean Donnan, who knows his business, refers to the activist IMF in the best sense of the word, particularly on the issue of worrying about people left behind, the inequality, climate, gender, and now you have raised a set of questions for some long-term renewed thinking on the issues of the low-income countries. I also want to say, I don't want to take up too much time because it's very limited time with you, but it's very good for us at CGD to have this sense of partnership with the IMF. We had a report on correspondent banking and anti-money laundering, many of the same recommendations. I think it was part of a general buildup of concern in the development community on that. And you might remember that the IMF was terrific about co-hosting with us the launch of our fantastic report on financial inclusion, sort of top-down work. There are many things like that where it's been just great. So I want to confine myself, if I can, to 2 questions, although I have a whole lot of questions based on what you said, in order to give time to those of you out there to address some questions yourselves. So I want to ask one question about the low-income country issue that you raised that was central to your remarks, and one question about the future of global governance. So on the low-income countries, as you said, many were doing very well, including in sub-Saharan Africa, very much associated with the fact of their adherence to macro fundamentals in the last 10 or 15 years, including following the global financial crisis, with sub-Saharan African countries going to the capital markets and maybe over-borrowing and so on. But the question is, was the development community, and that's kind of the royal we, for those in the room probably, too sanguine about the macro resilience of the low-income countries? Let me just back that up by saying I have often felt that we fail to understand that all 60 low-income countries should be thought of as fragile, in a sense. We know from history that countries that looked in great shape fall. We have the examples of Cote d'Ivoire many years ago. We have the example of Zimbabwe. We have examples in Central America where countries, so is the problem sort of a misunderstanding of how fragile countries are when they're poor? Is it a poor judgment about the potential for global shocks and global uncertainty, which we didn't anticipate in the depth or sort of the intensity at the moment, a sense that things are, really with Brexit, with political problems in the US and so on, with the refugee crisis in Europe, what is the balance there? Should we be revisiting fragility and low income status in itself, or should we be just resisting where we can in the way you were talking about the rise of this nativist, nationalist politics in the world? Or both, of course, but what's the balance there, looking back?
Right.
Monday morning quarterbacking.
I would make a few points. First point is, I think we need to, and I know that the center is very cautious with that. We need to stay away from overgeneralizing and saying all low-income countries are moving in that direction, or and we should not have said, and I don't think we actually said, that all low-income countries are on the rise. Because I think there is a huge difference between some of those countries that are, for instance, commodity exporters. And there are quite a few in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and those that are not necessarily exporters. And you mentioned Côte d'Ivoire. I think Côte d'Ivoire is a very interesting one because it does have some commodities, cocoa being certainly one of them, but it was not as blessed as other countries in the CEMAC region around it. And Côte d'Ivoire, as you know, for the last now 4 years, has grown at more than 7%, has not been particularly affected by the challenges that you know, other countries have faced. And yet, as you rightly said, at the time of conflicts and civil war, it was very badly affected when it had been on a course of quite steady and stable growth. So I think it's a good example to take where I think one factor which has really mattered a lot is institutional capacity, which we see in many countries. But I think in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, it has been quite relevant. Post-conflict, the ability of a country to reconstitute, rebuild the institutional capacity that it had, hopefully to eradicate as much as possible corruption, to re-establish normal payroll mechanisms, to sometimes insert digital as a mechanism to move money around without having, you know, the cut each and everywhere in between. I think that is a really important factor in order to, you know, consolidate sustainable growth. I would take another example of a country which does not have natural resources and has done quite well, I think, because of institutional capacity, because of strong leadership, and that is Rwanda, which is also under the strong leadership of Kagame, and with good institutional capacity, has been able to continue to grow reasonably safely. So my first point is that we should not put all countries in the same basket. They each are different and they have their respective characteristics. Second, institutional capacity is going to matter a great deal in order to help a country go through bad time, better times over the course of its economic development. But equally, there's a period of time when a country remains fragile. And even though it has natural resources, even though it can tap into the international bond market, it can very quickly revert back to fragility as we know it. The number of vulnerable countries, as we count them, particularly with reference to their debt level, has been on a slight increase recently. We have about 29 of them out of the 60. So it's
right. That's maybe part of the point.
But I also think that, you know, domestic revenue mobilization can also mean quite a lot for those countries, because if they have this, you know, if they master their resources and are not totally dependent on ODA, I think is a way towards this institutional capacity that I referred to.
Maybe we come back to this issue of the tax base. I was very impressed with the Senegalese finance minister at an IMF event talking about that issue. But I also
and he's still there. He's still there. Longevity,
that's a good point.
Longevity can be also good.
It's I can't resist just saying that Côte d'Ivoire also had the good luck of having a former IMF
correct,
become the president.
President Ouattara has been, yes.
So it may not be the best single example of institutional development, but but of something else, which is it helps to have good leadership. But let me go to the global governance issue. With the, I feel as though, I think a lot of people feel as though better global governance took a big hit indirectly with Brexit, because the European Union was, for many years, sort of the example of countries being able to collaborate, including on some political issues. So we're feeling a little bit deflated with the phenomenon here of the presidential campaign, the failure of austerity approach, not just in Greece, but in many other advanced economies. We have the refugee crisis in Europe. It was good for you to try to re-engage us in a kind of campaign of, yes, this can be done. I guess the question I have on the many issues you raised, climate and migration particularly, where in the case of climate, it's just not happening, that the resources are coming to deal with developing countries' needs, both to participate in mitigation and to deal with the resilience issues. And in the case of migration, where is global governance? Actually, the EU hasn't been able to do it in Europe, and certainly we don't have anything like the World Trade Organization in the UN system to go with the issue of better managing migration, which can be a win-win-win, as so much of the good work of my colleague Michael Clemens has shown in so many different ways. So what next? And how do you see those two issues? You will be at the G20 next week. What will you say about those issues? What will you push?
The positive person inside myself, while regretting, of course, the decision that was made by the British people, believes that it could be a catalyst for
a reawakening, or
a
wake-up call,
a momentum, a focus on the real issues that will make a difference in people's life. And I'm kind of encouraged to see that the European authorities are actually now focusing more so than before on the refugees, on how they adopt a pan-European response to the situation. But we have to be very cautious, because migration can have all sorts of different meanings. And when you talk to British authorities, migration, in the way it was central to the campaign, had a lot to do with, within European countries' migration. So in other words, those coming from
Poland
former
and
Central and
Romania.
Eastern European countries. When the European Union authorities at the moment look at migrations, look at refugee status, look at how they can accelerate the process by which they accept refugees, they are thinking about non-European countries coming to Europe. So on that latter point, I believe that the Europeans are likely to, I hope, come together, propose some pan-European approach to these issues. Because what we have seen so far is some common ground, but very limited, and a piecemeal country basis approach even within the European Union. So I can understand that this is not a particularly encouraging sort of collective statement to make. So if that catalyst function operates, at least in this domain, the Europeans should be able to come with a set of proposals, because I don't think that it can only be, how do you install refugees in various Greek islands, and how do you enforce a deal between the EU and Turkey, and how long does that stand? I think it's a two sides approach, where a collective development effort, which will be multifaceted, and a decent, proper, and organized way of hosting refugees when they qualify as refugees in those countries, on an even-handed and fair basis between the various Europeans. I think that would be a tremendous response to what is otherwise felt as, bad news for Europe. Somebody wants to go.
Yeah.
General de Gaulle always thought that would happen, by the way.
He had foresight.
Back in 1963, he said, no, not a good idea.
Yeah, I hope something like that happens, because then the EU can be an example of leadership that's needed at the broader global level. Certainly the remarks you made about the demographic issue and aging of populations in advance. I mean, it's a reminder to us. We've been worrying about this a lot at CGD, but I think we should really do a new revisit of what is the global public good here and what are the new products that the global community could create that would help spur along cooperation. And there is, we are doing a little bit of that work now, you know, how refugee bond-like instruments and so on that would make it easier, in fact, for many developing countries of middle income status to benefit from some immigration, as this country did for so much of its history.
Yeah.
So,
but here, I totally agree with you. We have done some work on refugees' success policies and experience within the European Union, because that was critical last year, if you remember. And there are some good examples of success, particularly in the Nordic countries. The issue here is both time and volume.
right.
Because, you know, by all accounts, even under the best circumstances, it will take at least 12 to 24 months to actually integrate, train, make sure that the person speaks the language, and then that the labor market is opened. Even with some, you know, intermediate steps, and Denmark, for instance, has adopted some really interesting policies from that perspective. So time is an issue, and volume is an issue, which is why, you know, coming up with a pan-European approach, which would take into account the burden sharing and the allocation, mindful of those, you know, tendencies of some countries to say, well, you know, I'm doing fine at home, thank you very much. So it's a tricky task, but it would be a formidable response, exactly as you said, in times where, you know, leadership is needed in that area.
Okay, I have other questions, but Rajesh will berate me. I cannot do that. So over to you, Rajesh.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Madame Lagarde. We have time for a few questions from the audience.
Maybe give me one, because I
Give
have
you
one
one question. Okay. Yeah.
if there's time.
President's prerogative. So we have microphones going round. I'm going to ask you to stand up, say your name, and we don't have time for statements, so if we can just go straight to a question for both our guests, that would be great. Let's start with, let's start with this lady here, that's gentleman there, and then this lady in the pink over here. I'll take 3 questions at once.
Thank you very much. My name is Yokai Mudzi, and I'm actually from Zimbabwe, where we currently have peaceful protests right now against bad leadership. But I've got a question. So is it realistic to continue to aspire to development as we currently define it, given climate change and the rate at which problems are growing? Is it realistic to think that Zimbabwe should be aspiring to development to develop to the extent that Spain has developed? What can development mean in the context of low-income countries if we rethink development?
Let me take a couple more questions.
Okay.
There was a gentleman there.
Thank you. Brad Johnson with RMA. My question goes to the intersection of low debt and low carbon emission. I know there are a number of environmental ministers that in low-income countries who would like to put in place energy efficiency programs, renewable energy programs, but to do so requires them to take out debt, which runs up against IMF's debt limitation requirements, especially for parastatals. Have you given some thought to that, and how would you suggest going forward in that area?
Okay, let's get some responses to those questions, actually. Madame Lagarde, should we start with the second question there?
Sure.
Low debt and low carbon emissions. You understood, you got the question.
Yeah. Are you aware that we have profoundly changed our debt limit policy last year, 2015? Because this change was precisely engineered in order to respond to the situation, well, not just to that situation, but to the need for countries to invest in infrastructure and to sometimes exceed the old debt limit as we had it. So we've really factored that in the new debt limit calculations that is applied. First of all, we have no such debt limits for countries that do not have a program with the IMF. They can really organize their financing as they wish. We just hope that they do it in a sensible way, and as referred to financiers, some of them went a little bit out of their way and a bit too much, in my personal view, when they went out on the bond market and borrowed in international currencies and overburdened themselves, at times when the reimbursement of the loans were becoming heavier and heavier as dollar appreciated, their currency depreciated. But it's only in respect of those countries that have a program with the IMF that we can but we can object to non-concessional loans in particular. But even in that new policy, which is far more flexible than what we had before, and even for a country that is in high vulnerability debt territory, which has a program with the IMF, and which is seeking a non-concessional loan, we make exception as well when the project that will be financed is making sense from an economic development point of view, so that we can find that right trade-off that I referred to earlier in my speech between the sustainable debt that we hope for the country, and that's part of the terms and conditions under which the IMF operates, and the need to finance infrastructure projects in particular. So I think with this new policy, we had a bit of a problem because some people could not understand what it was and how much of a change it was. I think many of the policymakers particularly in the sub-Saharan African countries, with which we have quite a few programs, understand now where they can go and how we calculate under those new terms the debt limit for countries under programs. So I hope we've made serious progress in that respect. It wasn't easy, but and I hope we were right to change it and to allow for more debt to be taken by those countries when it makes sense from an economic development and infrastructure investment point of view in particular.
Panelists, let's get a quick answer from both of you on the first question, and that will give us time for one more question. It was the question from this lady from Zimbabwe. Given the challenges that face the world, including, say, climate change, can Zimbabwe realistically aspire to develop in the way that, say, Spain has?
Maybe not necessarily like Spain, because I think each and every country is going to be different. But what's the alternative to development? Is it continued poverty, lack of access to resources, lack of jobs, many other things that I think inside myself, which I'm not going to comment upon publicly? The alternative is development, in my view, is economic empowerment, is public spending that is focused on the people of a particular country. You mentioned Zimbabwe, if you are from Zimbabwe. I think that's what needs to happen. And accountability is a critical piece in that equation. As you know, Zimbabwe has areas vis-a-vis the international community. And as a result, we cannot lend to Zimbabwe. And we are certainly very far away from doing any such thing because it requires clearing of the areas, but it also requires a lot of prior actions which go in the direction that I have just mentioned. Investing in the people, investing in education, in health, making sure that people have access to finance, making sure that there is accountability and that public spending goes to the people.
Nancy?
Yeah, I think a lot of people ask that question thinking of the issue of consumerism and the footprint, and how can it be that we expect all of the people in the developing world to have cars and drive to work given climate change and so on. I think there is in the broader development community much deeper understanding of that set of trade-offs than there was even 10 or 15 years ago. I think the issue, if we take the example of coal in India or coal in China, coal in South Africa, is that it is not appropriate for the rich world to be saying, no, you shouldn't be doing coal, that's dirty and that's bad for the climate. What is appropriate is for the rich world to have the resources to say, we can help you write down the current incremental cost of going clean instead of dirty. We should do that because we are part of the dirty problem and it's better for everybody. So I think it's just a very good example of another area where really serious push of global cooperation is needed to have those resources available that can be then a win for everybody, and in particular for developing countries, where, as Madame Lagarde said, the potential to contribute to global growth is so huge because they are growing well below their potential.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, we've all gone over a little bit. I'm going to give this lady, it's got to be a really good question. Okay, really succinct.
It's really short.
Okay.
I don't know if it's a good question, but it's a patriotic question. I'm from Ukraine. My name is Yulia Mendel, and we were supposed to get the tranche from IMF in February this year. So in July, Ukrainian issue had to be in agenda, but still it's not. And I know that our politicians are very irresponsible, and they still did not implement all the laws, did not adopt all the laws. So I would like to ask about responsibility of IMF before Ukraine and in front of Ukrainian people, and the difference maybe in relations because you stopped these tranches, please.
Okay.
Okay. Are you a journalist or are you a Ukrainian national who is genuinely interested? And maybe you are both.
Well, I am based in Washington from Ukrainian television, and
Okay.
So you're a reporter.
Well,
okay.
Okay. So first of all, I would like to salute the Ukrainian people, and I would like to pay tribute to the efforts that they have undertaken over the last few years on their journey towards accountability, responsibility, and economic empowerment. Most of the changes, if not all changes, that were to be undertaken by the Ukrainian authorities, in particular decisions by the Rada, have now been taken. So we're getting very close to the point where we could complete the review, which means then going to the board of the IMF and obtaining, if the board is satisfied, a release of the next financing of the country. There are still a few technical issues that need to be ironed out and that are part of the conditions that Ukraine has accepted and that we have negotiated together in good faith. So that needs to be finished because we cannot, have a half-baked program and hope that this will go for the better. So the job needs to be done, and I have full hope that both President Poroshenko and the new Prime Minister will take it to heart to actually deliver and implement to the last requirement what Ukraine has committed to do. But, I have huge confidence in Ukraine, and I hope we can get there promptly.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank you for coming, both in the room and online, and I'd like you to thank our guests, Christine
wait,
Lagarde.
I have a little present for Nancy, because I'm not sure
I didn't know
that-
about this.
That's how we like to surprise you. It's just that I will probably not come back for another presentation or discussion with Nancy in her current capacity. So I wanted her, when she has her next coffee, to have an IMF mug and a little souvenir from the IMF.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay seated while our panelists exit, and then I thank you very much for coming. Thank you.